Good evening, I'm Ramesh Ramachandran and you're watching Gravitas, where we dig deep into the headlines of the day and bring you various perspectives on an issue. On the big discussion tonight, we are going to take an in-depth look at relations between India and the US in all its forms and manifestations, including, but not limited to, the burgeoning defense relationship. Will the advent of Donald John Trump as the 45th president of the US bode well for India? Will he prove to be a boon or a bane? Will Trump break with tradition or continue to remain invested, like his predecessors were, in transforming the India-US relationship from the ground up, such that it reflects the realities of the 21st century? Also, can Prime Minister Narendra Modi of India do business with Trump? Less than 1 month into his inauguration, there are no easy answers yet to some or many of these questions that have engaged the attention of policymakers and analysts in India. So tonight, I'll attempt to deconstruct the intricacies of the India-US relationship in a language and format that you, the viewer, will hopefully find easy to digest and make sense of. Specifically, I'll be focusing on the current state of play in the India-US defense ties in the light of reports that Trump might not particularly be bullish about the idea of allowing American defense manufacturers such as Lockheed Martin to relocate some of their production facilities to India. Trump, as some of you would be aware, has spoken about, quote, America first, and again, buy American and hire American. Compare that with Narendra Modi's Make in India program. So does it mean there is already a strategic dissonance between the priorities and policies of Trump and Modi? Where does the India-US defense and security or strategic relationship go from here? And how will it compare with India's ties with Russia or Israel? Would Trump's overtures to Vladimir Putin of Russia and statements against China give India that much more room for maneuver? But on the other hand, how would Trump's attitude towards Iran, for instance, impact India going forward? And more importantly, will Trump call Pakistan's bluff and give India satisfaction on the issue of clamping down on Pakistan's support to terrorism directed against India and Afghanistan? To demystify some or many of these issues, joining me tonight on Gravitas is a very distinguished panel comprising Hardeep Singh Puri, a former permanent representative of India to the UN and author most recently of the book titled Perilous Interventions, the Security Council and the Politics of Chaos, who joins us from New Delhi. Amit Kaushish, a former financial advisor to the Indian Ministry of Defense, who is with me in the Vion studio here. Nitin Gokhale, senior journalist, author and a keen observer of defense and strategic affairs. And Richard Rosso, senior advisor and Vadhwani chair in India-US policy studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me on Gravitas tonight. Let me dive straight into tonight's show by first focusing on how plans to build the F-16 fighter in India have hit an air pocket in the form of Donald Trump. Now, he wants American companies to remain in America and not export jobs overseas. Take a look.
US fighter plane maker Lockheed Martin's ambitious plans to move the F-16 production line to India appears to have hit a roadblock. Reports suggest a rethink is underway given President Trump's insistence that American companies make it home and not overseas. Lockheed wanted to move its production line to India since orders for the F-16, a single-engine fighter, had dried up. It hoped to sell hundreds of F-16s to the Indian Air Force, which is short of fighters. The plan to build the F-16 in India in collaboration with an Indian private player also reflected government thinking. The only hitch here is that the Indian Air Force has not indicated if it's interested in the F-16. Media reports have hinted that the Indian Air Force would prefer the Gripen, a single-engine fighter made by the Swedish firm Saab. Saab has said it would set up a completely new production line for the Gripen in India. This would bring the latest generation Gripen fighter. Saab has indicated it is willing to transfer technology to India. The company is also willing to help resolve the glitches with the indigenous Tejas fighter. A final decision by the Indian government is only expected sometime in the middle of the year.
United States have never been stronger.
The key factors at play here would be cost and technology transfer. With Bureau Inputs, Zara Khan for WION.
Nitin, what do you make of the report that Donald Trump's government may want to take a, quote, fresh look at the Lockheed Martin's plans to move production of its F-16 combat jets to India?
Well, Ramesh, the whole issue, I think, is a little presumptuous to my mind. One, because the Indian government, as your own report has just suggested, and even to my limited knowledge, the Indian government hasn't even started to look at what are the options it will have for the Indian Air Force to augment its combat fighter jet strength going forward. They have bought the Rafale jets, as we know, 36 of them. But whether the next lot of combat jets that need to be bought are going to be a single-engine fighter plane, about 100 of them, or is it going to be a twin-engine, or is it going to be a mix of the two with the numbers? All that is not even on the drawing board, really. It's just a request for information, not even RFI, really, but some kind of information has been sought by the government from various manufacturers, and that's about it. So therefore, for a report to say that Donald Trump may be unhappy with Lockheed Martin's plans. Lockheed Martin may have a plan that it might want to shift to India. But the very fact that the Indian government hasn't even decided whether it wants that plane, F-16, itself negates the entire story or the entire plan. And therefore, it's a little premature in my view. We'll have to wait and watch until both the governments, that is, the Indian government decides, and then Donald Trump then tells Lockheed Martin not to move. So let's wait for the Indian government to decide what it wants for the Indian Air Force.
Right, Nathan. I want to take the same question to Mr. Kaushish. What's your sense, Mr. Kaushish? How disappointed will you be if Trump indeed revisits Lockheed Martin's proposal to shift its F-16 production line to India?
Well, I think it's not very surprising because America first, as it were, is not commensurate with Make in India. So obviously, India wants co-production, co-development, wants manufacturing to shift to India. On the other hand, if the primary objective in the U.S. is to save the jobs there, then it's not going to happen. And as Nitin said, in any case, it's not certain that India would go in for F-16 or F-18. So as of now, it's very difficult to say who's going to be the loser in this.
Right. I want to go back to Nitin. Nitin, how serious is the Trump administration in sustaining the momentum, as it were, in the India-U.S. bilateral ties? What do you think? And more importantly, would Trump's idea of America first militate against India's interests or expectations from the relationship?
Well, no, I think we'll have to look at it on two fronts, really. I think the India-U.S. defense relationship is actually, the defense component is central to the India-U.S. enhanced relationship over the last decade or so. Or in fact, going back 15 years, I would say. That defense has been driving the India-U.S. relationship quite steadily for the last decade. And therefore, it is not going to be a very fundamental change that we will see under the Trump administration either. What may happen is that you may not see the personal chemistry that you saw between Ash Carter and the former Defense Secretary of the U.S. and India's Defense Minister Manohar Parrikar. But professionally and on a professional kind of level, I think both the Pentagon and the MOD and even the free services in India and the American military have deep roots. The relationship goes quite deep, and therefore it's not going to see very major shake-up or a change. I expect it to remain steady. I expect you will not see any dramatic announcements to my mind. The DTTI may not get the kind of push that it saw under Ash Carter. And despite his push, despite intentions in the Indian Ministry of Defense, it hasn't really got off the ground. So therefore, DTTI may not see much progress in my view, but other aspects of the relationship, the defense relationship, will remain, I think, constant as it has been for quite some time now.
Right. And before I bring Ambassador Puri into the discussion, I want all of us to take a quick look at the most recent developments in the India-U.S. bilateral defense partnership. Defense Minister Manohar Parrikar had his first telephonic contact with his U.S. counterpart James Mattis late on Wednesday. Parrikar indicated that a formal meeting could take place soon to take forward bilateral defense cooperation. India has signed agreements for $15 billion worth of military equipment from the U.S. since 2007. The U.S. has offered to jointly develop with India the next generation military helicopter. Also, infantry combat vehicles in a trilateral partnership with Israel. India is buying 145 M777 light artillery gun for use in the mountains. Deliveries of 15 Boeing-built Chinook heavy-lift helicopter begins next year. Ambassador Puri, I want to get a sense from you about the contemporary India-U.S. strategic partnership, the current state of play, as it were, especially now that we have Donald Trump in the White House. Give us an overview, if you will, on how the India-U.S. relationship has evolved over the last decade or so and where it might be headed.
Ramesh, successive governments in Delhi have tried to add greater strategic content to the bilateral relationship with the United States. Yes, at one point of time, the term strategic partnership was also used. Although as a professional, I always like to view terms very carefully. Yes, there is greater strategic content, and I agree with Nitin. The defense segment of the relationship has been in the driving seat. $15 billion of defense equipment over a 10-year period is an impressive number by Indian standards, certainly. And I think there will be continuity in the defense relationship. I don't expect much change. But having said that, I want to introduce an element of caution here. The new administration in Washington is barely done 2 weeks plus. I think they are coming to terms with their overall foreign engagement and their economic policies. The United States is a $17 trillion economy. If they want to buy and hire American, if they want to locate all their production facilities in the United States, obviously that raises concern at some level with our own policies. But I think this is early days, and with tact and patience and mature handling, we will be able to achieve not only continuity in the bilateral relationship, but also hopefully get some significant improvements. But having said that, I found your report on the F-16 issue somewhat premature, because I have dealt with the defense issues. I had the privilege of spending 3 years in the defense ministry. Defense procurement issues are by definition very slow and cumbersome. You first have to identify what the vendor's interest is. Then you have to look at the possible platforms or weapon systems available in the market. And then you have to come to a determination. But that report suggested as if President Trump has a problem. But I am not aware that the government of India has made a determination, as 2 of your earlier speakers said. So I think it's very early days, and I don't think that either side, Washington or Delhi, would be looking at specific platforms or specific additional items on the procurement list so early in a new administration. Plus, we have other problems with the United States. You know, if they're going to be changing their policies on H-1B visas, if they're going to be looking at other issues of immediate concern, then surely we would want to look at defense procurement and see what kind of leverage we have on the other issues of interest to us. So I think it's still very early days in the new administration in Washington, and I think Delhi is handling this with great maturity.
Indeed. Before I go to Richard Rosso in Washington, I want to ask you, Ambassador Puri, since you mentioned H-1B visas, are there any other specific areas or concerns that you might have about the trajectory of the India-U.S. ties? Does a strategic congruence mark the bilateral relationship, or do you feel there's still much scope for improvement?
Well, you know, I am always looking at issues from the point of view of how the thinking in Washington is evolving. I have only mentioned H-1B visas because that is something on which there has been some discussion, and our own IT industries are. Even on that issue, I'm not unduly concerned, because I think you know, once the policy evolves, we'll be able to manage the fallout in case there is a raising of wages from 65,000 to 130,000. I think that can be managed. But there are, the India-U.S. relationship is a rich relationship. It's one of India's most important. But let's not forget, the relationship at different points of time has been transactional. And with the kind of dispensation we have in Washington, it is entirely possible that the relationship could become more transactional. I hope not, but if it becomes transactional, then we have to be just that much more careful, and we must do our due diligence.
Indeed. Richard, you heard Ambassador Puri and Nitin Gokhale speak there. Coming to you now, Richard, what's the sense you are getting about reports or the current state of play, as it were, in the India-U.S. ties, especially defense?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, the team that would really kind of guide this has yet to come together. At least the detailed officers have yet to come together. But, you know, I think I agree absolutely with what the others have said. If you take a look at the reasons that we've had such strong engagement in recent years, I mean, number one, with a long shot, don't forget, under the Obama administration, especially after the election of Prime Minister Modi, was on coming together for a global emissions energy deal. And, you know, with President Trump and his kind of outlook, that clearly is off the table. So the number one reason that we had such strong engagement is off the table. Number two, on defense, you know, India still is kind of a future partnership. Today, in the areas that we see as the most pressing global security concerns, the fight against the Islamic State, the rise of concerns in the South China Sea, Afghanistan. You know, militarily, India is still, you know, not a player in those fields. And so, you know, if you have, again, a very transactional president who is even calling into question traditional relationships like NATO, saying that partners aren't pulling their weight there, without a champion, we had a very unique champion in the United States, and our Defense Secretary, Ash Carter. So the question is, are we going to have somebody kind of that stature that's going to say, it's not about the fight today, we're willing to invest in this relationship for the future. If it's very find out what friends are doing today to contribute to our security interests, then India falls short in that today. So I do have a little bit of concern whether this trajectory can be maintained.
Indeed. Coming back to you, Nitin, talking specifically about the F-16, India can be expected to spend up to $300 billion. I'm told that Nitin is not available with us at the moment. Mr. Kaushik, if I can come back to you. Now, we are expecting India to spend close to $300 billion going forward over the next decade or so on defense modernization. Talk us through that aspect of the India-U.S. defense relationship.
See, first of all, the estimates vary from 150 to $300 billion. Right. It's very difficult to predict how much money is going to be spent. And all of this is not really going to be spent on buying platforms and so on. Secondly, you know, so far the growth in the trade between India and the U.S. Has been primarily on account of the off-the-shelf purchases. But the future from the Indian perspective lies in co-production and co-development, which is where I think this relationship is going to be tested in future. Because if that doesn't happen, then I think at some point of time it's going to become very difficult for India to go on just buying off the shelf from the U.S. It's not to say that there is nothing that's happening. Actually, there's a lot that is happening. There's a lot of bilateral engagement and so on. But it has to start showing some concrete results very soon. I mean, if you recall, there were 3 or 4 Pathfinder projects which were identified. Nothing much is heard of about those projects. And now there's a talk of another 2 new projects which are being talked about. The aircraft carrier technology that is being discussed. So while the discussions are going on, but there has to be some tangible movement for one to say that this is actually now gaining traction. And unless that happens, the momentum may be lost. So this money that is going to be there in the next 10 to 15 years may not necessarily go in this direction.
Absolutely.
India has and has been tapping other sources.
Indeed. Gentlemen, I want us to pause a moment and look at the India-Russia relationship for that matter. Now, while India has been steadily broadening its list of suppliers of military hardware, Russia remains the major mainstay. The Indian military uses a wide range of Russian equipment. The army uses T-90 tanks, infantry combat vehicles and artillery. For the Air Force, the Su-30 MKI is the frontline fighter aircraft. The infantry combat vehicles, and for the India strategic Russia connection, more interesting, Russia is the only country willing to supply strategic hardware to India. These include the Akula-class nuclear-powered attack submarine now in service with the Indian Navy. It's also helped India develop the indigenous Arihant line of nuclear missile submarines. Current plans include building Russian helicopters in India. Coming to you, Ambassador Puri, does Trump's overtures to Vladimir Putin of Russia and his remarks against China give India that much more room for maneuver? On the other hand, how would New Delhi be viewing Trump's attitude towards Iran, for instance, and Pakistan?
Ramesh, we have to be extremely careful here. India has a long-standing defense relationship which goes back to the era of the Soviet Union. Then we had, after the disintegration of the Soviet Union, we had a very strong defense relationship with Russia. I think it is imperative for us to continue that relationship. I personally believe that relationship has been subjected to some neglect, and that neglect can prove very costly from the point of view of our overall defense preparedness. So there is, on its own, a need for us to devote much more attention to restoring the vitality in the defense relationship with Russia. So that stands on its own. If President Trump is able to reset the U.S.-Russia relationship, that would be good news for everyone, because a resetting of the relationship between the United States and Russia will hopefully mean that there will be peace in places like Syria, that some of the spiraling conflicts which are taking place in places like Libya, Syria, Yemen, including the Ukraine, greater rapprochement and understanding between Washington and Moscow will bring some of those, will bring a calming effect to some of those situations, and that is good. Now, whether the relationship resetting between Russia and the United States, what it means for others, it's very difficult to say. I have always felt that these days the Russians don't come into a geopolitical equation alone. They come along with China. So I was very pleased to find that President Trump today, following his telephone conversation with President Xi, has decided to honor the one China policy. Now, from my point of view, that's good news, because you don't need turbulence in that area. Insofar as Iran is concerned, yes, we have witnessed some turbulence. I have always believed that the Iran nuclear deal, P5+1, will ultimately go through, but there will be posturing, there will be some negotiations, and they will declare victory after doing some deals. Please remember that the new dispensation in Washington is headed by a person without formal experience and exposure to governance. He comes to governance from the vantage point of a businessman. So the transactional dimension or the propensity to be transactional is going to be much higher. But India is a mature country. We are a country of 1.3 billion people. We are a $2 trillion economy. And we know how to anchor our policy in strategic autonomy and deal with Russia, China, Iran, and the United States all at the same time.
Interesting points you make there, Ambassador Puri. Now, coming to you, Richard, it's been barely 3 weeks since Trump's inauguration, but are you or have you been able to make out what his priorities might be in South Asia?
No, there really hasn't been a clear articulation. He's had outreach, to India, to Pakistan, and in both of those, it didn't really get into detail or substance yet. Most of the key team leaders that'll really shape the policy and develop the parameters, Senior Director at the National Security Council, the Assistant Secretary of State, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Asia Defense Policy at the Pentagon, all these positions are still open right now. So really the most that you have to go by is, some things that you've seen in the past. General Mattison's work in Central Command. I think one key person that has joined the administration that has a good India background is Ken Juster. He's going to be assistant to the president for Asian economic issues, and he was very active in the high technology cooperation group under President Bush. But by and large, India still at this point, it's a future player, but he's mostly been dealing with what we can most urging pressing crises in the world right now, in kind of the first areas where he's tried to begin to shape a policy. So I think we've yet to see the real parameters on what this is going to be. But the offer to invite Prime Minister Modi to visit Washington, D.C. this year, obviously, once those dates start to crystallize, then the machinery will definitely get in motion, because for those kind of bilateral summits, you want to make sure that you make it impactful when you can. So I don't think it's going to be too long. I think there are other countries that'll have to wait a little bit longer. Getting a summit like this on the table is going to be a focus factor that's going to get people's minds in shape on what the parameters are going to be.
Absolutely. Richard, please stay on while I go to Mr. Kaushish here in the studio. Mr. Kaushish, are there any specific concerns that you would want to flag in the India-U.S. defense and security relationship that needs immediate attention from both New Delhi and Washington?
See, I think U.S. has been taking India-specific steps, like it's recently decided to grant a special status to India. But there has to be more reciprocity from India's side. To begin with, there has to be clarity as to what India wants from the U.S. In my opinion, there is some lack of clarity, because we are talking to everybody about everything.
Right.
And most of these purchases are on strategic considerations. Whether we admit that or we don't is a different thing. So we have to be clear. We can't be playing footsie with everybody. That's one thing. Secondly, the American companies also have a lot of concerns. For example, they have a lot of concerns in regard to implementation of the offsets. We need to take care of those concerns. And then there is certainly a question of, the trust deficit. There continues to be some amount of apprehension as to what will happen in critical times, and also about the transfer of technology. So those concerns have to be mutually addressed. And I think it takes time. I mean, the growth that has taken place between India and US in regard to defense trade, it's phenomenal. In the last 10 to 15 years, from zero to it has come to about 14 billion dollars. It has taken longer for US to develop that kind of relationship with some of its own NATO allies. So the things are on the right track, but India needs to be clearer as to what kind of engagement it wants with US, what is it that India wants from the US, and the US also has to take into account the concerns that India has. India can't possibly, as Ambassador Puri also said, for example, it can't really shut its doors to Russia. A large proportion of what we have today is of Russian origin, and it will continue to be in service for the next 2 to 3 to 4 decades, even if we don't buy any new weaponry or equipment. So we need to, and we have to remain engaged with Russia, and Therefore, India will have to, strike this balance between its engagement with U.S. and Russia and even other countries. That sensitivity has to be taken on board.
I want to go to Ambassador Puri now. Ambassador Puri, you heard Mr. Kaushik speak there about how India would want to strike a balance going forward between the US and Russia. And you also alluded to that in your earlier intervention. Now, speaking specifically about India-Russia relations, can India afford to take Russia for granted diplomatically or militarily? There have been many recent incidents that would indicate a possible realignment of interests on the part of Russia, especially with countries in India's immediate neighborhood.
Well, yes, I certainly think we have to be extremely careful here. But I would, before I answer your specific question, I think Mr. Kaushik also made another very important point, that we have to be clear as a country as to what our strategic objectives are and how we intend to pursue those strategic objectives, because he used the word playing footsie with others. I try to describe that somewhat differently, that we need to maintain our strategic autonomy. We need to, and we are seeking greater strategic content in our relationship with the United States. And I think that is an absolute imperative now. But to what extent you want to take that seeking of greater strategic content? Do you want to have a relationship which gets total strategic convergence? Because strategic convergence would mean that some of your other flexibilities, which are inherent in the concept of autonomy, strategic autonomy, then you have a tendency to undermine those. As far as your specific question about Russia is concerned, I must confess I get worried sometimes, because as Mr. Kaushik said, our exposure in terms of the defense area, our naval platforms, our aerial our weapon system, it's very much still a Russian origin equipments that we are using. Now, you cannot, you mentioned a country in our neighborhood. I know what you're talking about, our western neighbor. There have been some reports which sometimes appear alarming, but apparently we are reassured by the Russians from time to time. But again, in this game, I remember when I was a young Joint Secretary in Delhi, the then Prime Minister, Mr. Narasimha Rao, used to tell some of us, and those are wise words, that be careful. This is no longer the Soviet Union which you can take for granted. You don't have friendship prices in which we used to have when we used to buy naval frigates from the Soviet Union. There are commercial considerations, and by all means, most certainly you cannot take Russia for granted. Russia will be as commercial. Russia has been transactional. So you have to deal with a new situation which has evolved, where all the people we are dealing with are transactional. So this transactional label doesn't apply to only one. They're all transactional. But then, therefore, you have to be careful to what extent you want to seek strategic convergence. You might decide that good relations with the United States, and I am one of those who subscribes to that, actually help you improve relations with China. And vice versa. But you are not in a position today, given the developmental challenges we have as a country and the kind of threat perceptions we have, the kind of situation we find ourselves in, we have to necessarily play all sides at this point of time, even whilst we seek greater strategic content in our relationship with the United States.
Absolutely, Ambassador Puri. And since you mentioned the phrase strategic convergence, I'd like to ask you to dwell a little bit on another phrase which did the rounds a couple of almost a decade ago, when India was negotiating the India-U.S. nuclear deal, and that phrase was strategic congruence. So, as compared to strategic convergence, would you advocate strategic congruence as well on many issues, especially, for instance, China or the South China Sea or the Asian pivot or rebalance of Washington?
Well, Ramesh, since you started with the India-U.S. nuclear agreement, let me tell you, without the heavy lifting that the United States did in our favor, we would never have got the change in the rules of international business to our advantage. You know, the NSG exception, the India-specific IAEA safeguards agreement, Believe me, as we are realizing now, if you don't have the United States on your side, that kind of heavy lifting would not have been done, and we would have not got the civilian nuclear agreement through. It's an entirely different issue whether we have been able to commercially exploit that agreement or not. That requires a separate discussion. But yes, strategic confluence is perhaps on a lower order, and we had some strategic confluence of interest or congruence of interest whereby these things were possible. The other exceptions that the United States has made, recent changes, I think Mr. Kaushish referred to it, or you did in the earlier part of the program, these are welcome signs. But you know, this is a continuing process. As a student of evolving situations, I always ask myself, and I always place this consideration, how much of continuity and how much of change. Now, continuity is essential. You need to consolidate the gains you've got, but when you seek further improvements, you have to define the extra congruence or confluence or strategic convergence that you are seeking, because you must be able to deliver on it. I think one of the underlining points that maybe an underlying consideration that Mr. Kaushish had is that when he said that India is not clear, I think India needs clarity, and India also needs, in addition, a realistic determination on whether we are able to deliver on our part of the bargain. There's no point getting into an arrangement if you later start dithering on it. And most countries, you know, are upfront in terms of bold conception. And then when it comes to implementing the deal, the nuclear deal is a classic case in point. The then Prime Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh, was willing to make his government vulnerable at one point of time because he was so keen on it. I think he understood the benefits of it. But what has happened after that? There is very little that we have to show in terms of commercial exploitation and commercial contracting of the deal. And yet, I think it's a very important instrument. So that is the kind of, caution pointers that I was trying to introduce in the discussion, nothing beyond that.
Indeed, Mr. Kaushish, you heard Ambassador Puri there. Now, if I were to ask you to take a step back, pause and reflect on the overarching India-U.S. defense relationship, given the security environment in our immediate neighborhood, what can India and the U.S. do to enable India to become a net provider of security in the Indian Ocean region?
See, India is technology hungry. So to answer it in very simplistic terms, if what India needs is something that the US can provide, and it coincides with our sort of Make in India initiative, it'll be of great help. But as I said earlier, it's not just the US. I mean, I think we'll need to remain engaged with other countries, especially Russia. And we need to, both India with the US and India with Russia, we need to address our mutual concerns. The main thing in both these relationships would be that India has to become self-reliant in regard to defense production, which is where India itself has to decide what does it want from both the countries. It will have to dispel certain impressions which have been created. For example, there is question about the sustainability of the modernization program.
Right.
While we do talk about $250 or $300 billion worth of expenditure in the next 10 to 15 years, but if you look at the yearly allocations, you know, the question arises whether this kind of modernization drive is sustainable over a long period of time. So the issues like this need to be addressed, and unless we do that, and unless we are clear as to what do we want from both these countries, and then you know the dialogue goes on, and we find solutions to the problems which arise as we go along, we will not be able to reach anywhere.
Before we slip into a quick break, I want to go one last time to Richard in Washington. Richard, you heard Ambassador Puri speaking there, and also Mr. Kaushik here in the studio now. There's a lot of debate and discussion here in South Asia about a possible revival of the quadrilateral arrangement between and among India, the US, Australia and Japan, given in light of President Obama's pivot to Asia or rebalance to Asia. How do you see that initiative going forward under a Trump administration?
Well, I mean, I think those of us that look at it see a lot of logic to it. I think this idea that ASEAN itself could become, a powerful security-based construct is really, the whole has come out of that balloon pretty easily as China began to pick apart and build relationships separately with ASEAN members. They've been unable, even when something is obviously disruptive, as China not following the UNCLOS dispute ruling to which they are a party and signatory. So ASEAN has not been that structure that I think has been able to provide a security bulwark in Asia. So alternative structures, certainly make a lot of sense looking at it from the outside. From the inside, though, I think in the United States, we've even had difficulty when we talk about the India-Japan trilateral relationship. The reason for that, if you go back to why the United States originally was supportive of a trilateral, at the time, we didn't think that that India was comfortable actually having serious discussions with the United States directly on emerging security threats. And so bringing Japan in for that conversation, we felt was a way to kind of add the comfort level. And of course, Japan has shared interests there. But in practice, U.S.-India bilateral cooperation, India's bilateral with Japan, is moving much faster than the trilateral cooperation has been able to. So when we talk about a quadrilateral, bringing another party in, we haven't even seen that many tangible outcomes from the trilateral U.S. India, Japan shared interest. Getting 4 countries to have the same kind of perception on shared threats and security interests at the same time can be very tricky and difficult to do. So I think it makes a lot of sense, but I think in practice it's a lot tougher to get momentum on it than what I think we'd like to believe. So I certainly support it. I think a lot of people in Washington support the concept for it, but in practice it may not be the best use of time and energy based on what we've seen with the trilateral so far.
Indeed, Richard and Ambassador Puri, please stay on while we take a break on Gravitas. When we return, we talk about Trump's travel ban. Stay tuned to Gravitas.